Hello everyone, today we talk about the Christianization of the juridical and sacral prestige connected to weapons from the previous barbarian and chiefly Germanic, at least in this video specifically, tradition had already had, right? And in this, of course, adoption of the religion of peace of Christianity that had already assumed at this point in history its own, let's say, military character, already, and in part actually directed initially against these populations that were the enemies at one point of the Christian Empire, right, of the Roman Empire, such, and that in this progress of Germanization of Roman culture definitely created an hybrid that had to cope really with the fact that all the peoples were progressively Christianized still retained this very deeply rooted set of this ethos, warrior ethos essentially, that attributed an enormous importance, in fact, to even to exterior symbols of like weaponry, like this status connected to the political and military prestige, strictly speaking. And this is a very big topic. Actually, it would be better explained if we had explained before the actual juridical-sacral prestige that revolved around weaponry and swords specifically, but not only, because the spear, for example, is in theory at least the most ancient of these weapons, and the one to which even in a certain political measure was connected the prestige of the entire peoples rather than the elites that now were taking over through much better equipment, including the sword, right? But this is another topic. But I thought it was fine to discuss it today as well without that introduction that we will make. We will make a video on the pagan tradition, on the sacrality of the sword. But, as you know, in Schwerpunkt, we discussed essentially about this passage, about the transformation, but much more of the continuity that existed in, we can say, in the European culture, but this exists actually outside of it, or many people essentially believed practically the same things. In this passage, from tribalism, nomadism, to statal forms and sedentarism, etc., that, however, maintains certain ideologies and symbols and forms of, let's say, even of political and social interactions that are connected with the exercise of arms. That at this point is, pretty much a regular part of the political dialectic. Without much of an exception. So it's the great problem, naturally, of the Christianization of cultures that doesn't matter where here we're talking about the Germans specifically speaking. This is valid also for the Roman Empire as a whole. It had to cope with the fact that, the totalizing principles of Christianity are, even in a pacific intention, and which is not pacifistic, and this is important though, could not be erased. Hence this hybrid of chivalry in Christian form, let's say, that, however, in essence remained essentially built out of other values, of other mindsets that lasted actually for a very, very long time. We can argue that they actually never stopped, because we assume somehow that, I don't know, the 13th century European knight is just now a normalized Christian with, just merely, I don't know, not necessarily pacific, but at least kind of secularized ideals that has forgotten about the time of the forests, of the tribes, etc. This is really not true, and you can argue that even the evolution of the West, in its deteriorated forms, has maintained this call for for the cult proper of violence, of the fury, of the warrior character. Think about, I don't know, National Socialism in the 20th century, right? So it's a component of our civilization that we can't really erase, and for a simple reason that it's written in our genes. That's the real problem, like in many ways. We know that our civilization improved essentially as long as it got rational, right? And Christianity was doing, contrarily to what many wish to believe, because I don't know, maybe they have prejudices against Christianity or any other religion, by actually assuming another one at their place, is that it did make a great work of rationalization of these forms, because they couldn't be erased. They couldn't, and there was no way, and not even an intention actually, to eliminate them, right? Because the Christian message has always been radical, too radical to be actually real. It's a highly ideal message that I think contains a geniality, one of the greatest intuition of tending towards the ideal, but never quite reaching that, because humanity is weak fundamentally by the original sin, and therefore there are in the world, right, certain things that must necessarily happen, right, that include war and injustice and violence and things that shouldn't happen, but at the same time need a certain component of society to deal with them anyway, right? This is very important. I made a video about St. Paul and the Militia Christi, like Militia Christi, let's say better in Latin. That is essentially looking at this perspective. I mean, realizing that Christianism has always remained highly ideal and idealized, and there are certain currents within it that also took kind of different orientations in this regard. Think about the secular clergy or monasticism, for example, had two very different ethical parameters in many ways. And the Christianization we're talking about today is something that passed definitely through the realization, of course, the Christian society required a political and a military direction, right? The concept of, I gave for assumed here, we know why we couple the two things, because if you don't do, if you think that politics is separated from the military side of the story, you basically haven't understood anything about anything in history, literally, and I'm not kidding, right? And this is not, I don't want to address you necessarily to the Fun Clausewitz playlist, but the ideal that we have now, that a society must be intrinsically pacific for whichever reason, is a pacifistic instance that is essentially one of the most radically violent and oppressive and unjust ideologies can be ever formulated. All people need to use violence in order to defend themselves, at least. And Christian society was essentially assuming the same thing as every other society does, right? And trying, however, and this is the work of civilization, to normalize certain traditions that let's say the violence of which, the military ideals of which were praised in part, but from the other, they also contained a somewhat disruptive element in the whole picture. The idea is that the state is superior to the tribe. The idea is that the state can't be seen even as a set of tribes, but it's essentially a working together at a more intellectual form, in a more intellectual form that surpasses true reason, rationality, the blind fury of the tribe, which is what throughout all military history always happened, right? The warrior is a loser fundamentally, and this is what also, you don't hear much around, in the sense now we came up with this delirium that our military should be kind of the warriors. No, those are not warriors. Those are citizen soldiers. This is a very, very different thing. The warrior is just a kind of a, maybe we relegate these ideas for children that need to think that there are warriors out there that fight for them. No, it doesn't work like that. And our civilization and the power and the weight of it passed through the annihilation of tribalism, through violence, which is what granted us to live in the way we do, which is dramatically better than anything these guys could hope for, right? So if you don't like these ideas, don't follow Schwerpunkt, because definitely this is not the place to to tell fairy tales. And it is this site, even though it talks a lot about Aryans, about the Indo-European tradition, etc. This is literally nothing to do with tribalism, with nationalism, with racism of any form. So this is something we relegate to garbage and rubbish, and for people who have a lower intelligence. Here we talk about real history, and we tell things as they are, through historiography and scientific production. So we don't care about what those people think. The concept at this point is realizing how Christianity managed to channel those forces that came from these large areas of Europe, of Central, Northern Europe, but not only, right? Because early medieval Europe is something that was built very progressively. Especially, this is a Western story, in part. We will extend it on Schwerpunkt also to relations, for example, with the Byzantines, I don't know, the Slavic world, etc., and beyond, telling the truth, because the area of the steppes, frankly, is quite overlooked and quite misunderstood, even in terms of actual, identities and shared values, etc. And that's where it's towards the steppe that we essentially have to look at if we want to understand European history at its core, right? And naturally, the history of Western Europe was, during early medieval times, very, let's say, it went at a slow pace, right? It wasn't a dramatic transformation, evolution. So what makes it so interesting and eventually characterizes so strongly what chivalry, as we know it, mostly through, hopefully not through the romanticization of the 19th century, which is another load of garbage, but essentially through actual studying of political, military, and social affairs of the feudal age, etc., so-called at least, is really starts from here, and it starts from a hybrid of several traditions that essentially managed to create new political and social structures that could cope essentially with the control of the populations, with the general need of pacification, right? This is a very controversial topic in the sense that many people essentially say, okay, the world always got worse, right? The rich guys always got richer, and therefore they began to oppress always many people. Well, it doesn't seem to me that how this is historically gone, because history has sensibly improved, right? This doesn't mean that civilization hasn't produced horrors, or think about the last century, or what, and that these roots, these veins, have not been reinterpreted in a negative, disruptive way, right? And those who have done it have paid for it, right? If you have an entire generation of males sent to die on, in the number of millions, right, of a country, like it happened, I don't know, in the Eastern Front, you do realize how harshly they paid for this mistake. And that's where tribalism fails, right? This is not just anecdotal. But the concept is, more than else, realizing that we haven't lost part of this element. That in part is, at least didactically, educationally speaking, very important to understand ourselves and to understand where instinct ends and reason begins, and how essentially the latter is capable of crushing and repressing what is in fact irrational but detrimental for the wealth, the welfare of our world, right? That's why there is no place in this channel for things like militarism, pacifism, because these things are literally harmful. Like, if you enforce one of the two, it doesn't mean that they are opposite. Their effect is going to be devastating anyway, because you're essentially forcing a wrong take on reality that we know repeatedly having failed, right? And that cannot be our way. Our way is the one looking at history, like in part, of course, but we have explained, in fact, in the Von Clausewitz playlist, how much is important to look at military history to assess, fundamentally, how violence is used, politically speaking, and how, at that point, the responsibility really, first of all, falls on you. This channel is not for entertainment. This channel is for reflecting, right? Even if I say stupid things, because it's always worth even to hear stupid things, maybe. It's also worth to hear intelligent things, but you are the only one who can discern which it really is, right? So what I'm talking about in here, I started actually from religion, right? And yeah, I remembered this because I was essentially saying, when you talk about the Christianization of the Germanic peoples, or whatever the hell they called themselves, like, that I made even a video on early Germanic identity. It's not a big deal. I use Germanic as I use Byzantine, right? It doesn't mean anything, but, whatever. We know what we're talking about, at least, and that's the point of the story. It's definitely legitimate to wonder up to which point, actually, the Germans actually adopted a religion of peace such as Christianism. But the other question is also legitimate to, wonder up to which point their own Christianism was a religion of peace, right? And how much, not just their own Christianism was a religion of peace, but how Christianism was a religion of peace or not at that time elsewhere. That's why we began discussing, essentially, the nature of the imperial ideal, chiefly, around which Christianity revolved, and the fact we've made countless videos about this. I mean, the idea that the pagan idea of the empire that had survived from the ancient world, that was shared not just by Rome, but basically by all the Indo-Europeans, not only, was just clothed in a Christian fashion after the Christianization of the empire. The Christian one is really a pacific message, right? But it's also violent in its forms. I mean, have you ever read the Bible, but especially even just the Gospels? It's a radically violent message, the Christian one. I mean, by definition, it couldn't be so otherwise. And it must be so, because if you're not radical here, you can't achieve a good nothing, right? We will see now what we're talking about, of course, without... and there are many sides of the story, and we can't cover it today. For today, I think it's important just to remember something that is otherwise already known, telling the truth. If you look, for example, I don't know, at the laws of the Longobards and the Bavarians, right, that were Christian at one point. By the 7th century, they were essentially Christianized in large part, already converting to Catholicism. Telling the truth, the Bavarians were Catholic since the beginning, also because they had passed through the Frankish channel in that sense of Christianization, so they hadn't switched they hadn't begun as Arians like the Longobards had done, for example. And I mean, this area essentially of southern Germany and northern central Italy, that is fairly well documented. In some ways, the Longobards themselves expanded towards the Danubian watershed, telling the truth, within the Alps, right? So it was there were actually two close peoples that also intermarried at the dynastic level, and they actually had the same language. Even they were Elb Germans, originally speaking, just like the Swabian, the Alemanni, as they were also called. That we'll also discuss later a little bit. Well, these Christian peoples now, in the early Middle Ages, they talked about the Arma Sacrata. That is, the sacred arms, right? Which means something precise in here. It means that these weapons were exorcised. They were consecrated. Like, literally, these weapons were taken on the altars and consecrated in front of the cross, right? And the most important thing about this is that this sword, once consecrated, essentially could be used to swear on it, or to use it, for example, for God's judgment, right? Judicial duels, for example. Judicial duels were, for example, a tradition we know it from the Longobard laws, because at the beginning of the 8th century, King Liutprand wanted to ban this practice, because objectively it's an horrendous thing. Like, these guys essentially didn't even fight them by themselves. They hired champions that fought on behalf of them. This was legal. It was something that the Longobards had done since a long time. And Liutprand was actually a civilized king, the voice of reason, like not the voice of tribalism. We're saying in his laws, in his additions to the Edictum Rotari, we would like to ban this thing. We would like to ban judicial duel because objectively is unjust, right? Because the guy who gets the best champion wins, and this has nothing to do with justice, right? And Liutprand was a guy that cared a lot about and knew how to make it work, make his kingdom work very well. But he also stated openly that this provision could not be enforced because essentially it would have been impossible to eradicate this practice from the Longobards people. And we're talking about 8th century Italy here. We're not talking about 6th century Pannonia, right? This is something very important to bear in mind. What was the deal? What had happened, really? Well, it's obvious that the consecration now had a function to justify at the eyes, or at least formally, Christians, the sacral use of the same weapons. Right, this was obviously an old and pagan use, but it was so deeply rooted in the civil mentality of these peoples, right, and in their juridical uses that it could not be renegated. Especially in a society that drew from war the reason for its own institutions and structures. Now, this is very important because here we're talking essentially a Romano-Germanic kingdom, right? We don't have a great deal about the Bavarians because the Bavarians were like not even a kingdom proper. They were a duchy. They were this strange thing floating between Longobard Italy and Frankish Gaul that, since it was peripheral to both, kind of, remained a bit autonomously on its own. But it didn't have the same amount of civil development, especially of the Longobard kingdom, right? Because the Franks didn't have much of it, telling the truth. But it's obvious these peoples had all their civil regulations. I mean, these were born as tribal populations that had a specific past, right? Now this has changed because the migration era does change a freaking lot. These populations were Romanized, but even before coming within the boundaries of the Roman Empire, they had been civilized in part. The Germans of the 3rd century are not the Germans of the 1st century BC. There's something very different. You don't go like freely as something separated after having spent like half of a millennium next to the Roman Empire. It doesn't happen, right? So these peoples had also compacted their, we can say their national cohesion. Who were the Longobards? Like, do you think these were actual ethnic defined ethnic groups, you could say, essentially what they were? There was definitely an Traditionskern, an ethnic core of the people that has, especially in the case of the Longobards, a dramatic capacity to absorb and to Longobardize, in fact, which is essentially a juridical process, the people, right? And this means in a world without state, like the one of the 6th century, for example, that there is an hegemonic ethnic core that essentially shows the ways of living, of regulating society, right? So, dealing with justice, essentially, because that's the first thing they heard. But there are lots of other peoples that gravitate around these guys and that are absorbed by them. So when they settle in Italy, everything changes because, first of all, these guys are dramatically numerically inferior to the populations of the places they've settled in. So they mix immediately in very few generations, and they have to rule in a place that had always been, that had civilization for a millennium, right? So you can't say that it was simply a, we're looking in the 8th century time of Liutprand, of a world that is still Germanic, right? That everything was, like in Rügen or in Sweden, and where these guys had come from, right? It was not like that, evidently, but still, the Longobards at this time means essentially the Italians living in fact, within the kingdom, right? Because at this point they're all juridically Longobard. have Germanized, also have maintained essentially, let's say better, and their Germanic tradition in these centuries, for which it was normal for people that essentially legiferated, for example, through the assembly of armed warriors, right, on a regular base ever since the origin of the people, the practice of judicial duel. The idea that in the judgment by the sword past God's will. This is dramatically important because it wasn't, first of all, the whole deal we're talking about now is that which God, right? Because, of course, the Christian God, but we know perfectly well that in early medieval Europe, the two things, the pagan tradition and Christian one coexisted for a long time. In Lombard Italy, you can find plenty of syncresis between, I don't know, this inferic, for example, the Archangel Saint Michael, right? That's a figure that had an enormous success among the Longobards, and guess why? Because he waged a sword in the name of God and defeated Lucifer, right? And there was this, the Longobards, when they migrated in Italy, if you look at their art, which reflects largely their kind of mental background, I mean, these people were seriously messed up, but I mean seriously messed up, and they're exemplificative essentially of what still at the time of Charlemagne, essentially Central Europe and Northern Europe still it was. I mean, the world seen as a place where you can be essentially devoured, torn apart, with limbs scattered all over by giant universal snakes, and people killing each other. And this evil, you can see the evil in here. I mean, the pride, which is present, by the way, even in the Longobard, even in the Historia Longobardorum, which is a normalized text by the Christian Paul the Deacon, you can still find the ancient pride of the Longobards who enjoyed thinking at the fact that, I don't know, for example, the ugly and the stupid are people have to be eliminated, and rightfully so, and in the most atrocious ways. This is what these people truly believed, right? It's not an invention of this is a very controversial topic, right? Because what does this remind you? Well, it does remind you essentially about eugenetics. It reminds you about a world that claims that there is an Übermensch, right? And the fact that truly those thousands that marched across Central Europe, Southern Europe in the 1st century BC, these were people who were genuinely believed with all of themselves that Wu Won had the right to rule. The weak had to go down. Point. You could dispose of his life, whatever thing. This was a brutal war, and the point is, why was it? Do we have to blame these people? Because nowadays it seems as if essentially you say these things. You say, these people was bad, therefore we shouldn't study about it. No, you should, because those are humans exactly like you, because we haven't changed any freaking deal, not even by the slightest, biologically speaking, by those times. We're literally the same animals by all standards. So this means simply something that if you were put in the conditions these people lived, quite likely you would believe exactly the same things. And guess what? Those same things in a world like Central Europe, Northern Europe was pretty meager and pretty, it had to bring you necessarily to make war because there weren't enough resources. Like every time there was a population surplus, you didn't know how to feed these people, hence you had to go out there and basically butcher other people to survive. It was literally how it was. This is nomadism in a nutshell. I mean, the Germans weren't nomadic, of course, but they shared a certain... they did migrate. They were semi-nomadic at one point, at least. Before migration era, they were largely sedentary and agricultural, but they still were imbued with this sense of of extreme pride about essentially the military function. We do know, even from Alemannic laws, for example, just to complete the triad here, the Elbe Germans, that men essentially swore by by the sword. Women on their breasts, essentially. And these were the functions, and there wasn't much else of that. That's how society worked, and naturally there was a social certification of some sort. There were people who worked to land. There is definitely a difference between the zip and the comitatus, but the idea is still like the one that was shared also by the Romans, telling the truth, by pretty much anyone at the time, that if you wage arms and you win, you're basically justified, legitimized by God to rule. That's brutal as it is, and that's why you should be very, very, very happy that you are born today and not at the time, because, you know, that sucked, right? Even if you were the guy who was in charge, because these systems were dramatically unstable, right? The chieftains rose and fell with extreme ease, and the whole deal of society revolved around this. Why all the Nordic mythology, and so that they revolve exclusively around this idea of manhood based essentially on war. But then you realize there is not just that. There are other, that society is slightly diversifying, but they were coming essentially from that background, and they were still completely convinced of the righteousness of this idea. So that even in a a civilized place like 8th century Longobard Kingdom actually was, you still find that society did regulate itself through judicial duel, and that was the deal, right? Just think of what this means in practice, in everyday life. But let's pass, for example, through. But I wanted to stress also another aspect of this story is that the same Longobard Kingdom, we said it before, emanated laws on the basis of the assemblies of the freemen, right? They were warriors, ideally, right? It's obvious that even here, the kingdom that existed since 1 century and a half, essentially, had normalized much of this. There was not like an assembly of all the Longobard people who came in one place, and the king said, "Okay, let's make this law," and then all the people shook their spears and or banged them over their shields, etc., to accept it. It didn't work like that, right? That's not how civilized society works. But it was still believed as the essential foundation of the kingdom itself, because the kingdom was based essentially on that political and military direction. Law is made by people who carry arms. This is the mental the cultural horizon of these people. And things would evolve over time, right? But this is just one example. But if you look at the rest of Europe, you realize that many other lands still lived essentially not very differently from what they had done, in the previous millennium, right? And Christianization helps at getting kind of more constructive side of this. Or this is the concept I would like to stress today more than else. That Christianity, the idea of pacification, is a rational idea. Because being pacific, once again, doesn't mean that you don't bear arms. This is nonsense, right? Disarmed societies disappear. Simple as that. But that the use of violence, most of the times, is objectively not the best one. It's just the speediest one. And if you really want to grow as a state, if you want to become more powerful and impose your direction on someone, actually the cleverest thing to do is not to do it through arms, most of the times. Then there are times you actually must use arms, right? Because there is not other way. Like if it's especially you meet someone who simply doesn't want, like you go in a direction, that person in another, and there is no way you can reconcile your ideas, that's when violence usually breaks out. But there must be consistent reasons for that too. And at that point, especially if you're aggressive, you can't do without being armed. You can't do without saying, okay, well, and you know why? Because simply society will arm itself at one point. even if you pretend that, yeah, we are civil, and this is the greatest lie of the last 50 years, I would say. It was from the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. This idea, this widespread idea that essentially war is not civilization, that war is not civil, that war is for barbarians. These are culturalist ideas that are completely radical, because they don't distinguish the fact that without that you can't actually choose whether politics has a military option or not, because politics always has, and there are certain situations in which you have to use it. How do you fight terrorism without violence? How do you fight dictatorships without violence? How do you resist to oppression without violence? Violence is necessary. We just know, and pretty damn carefully, how to use it, which is a wholly different point from saying, okay, no, war shouldn't be done ever because it's wrong. No, it's not necessarily wrong. Most of the times it's wrong, but saying it's always wrong, it's just plain stupid, because otherwise we would have not had a liberation. But this is another thing, and the Christian ideals deeply revolve around this point, right? As we have said before, the Christian message in form is probably one of the most radically violent ever existed in the history of philosophies and religions, right? And this is what it makes it so damn intelligent. That's why before I was saying that certain parts of Christianity took other paths, like the ascetic one, right? We have to be completely honest about certain ideas. Is that you can think of a world that's totally kind of pacific, but everybody basically lives in an eremitic form. Then what kind of a world would that be exactly? How could we improve? How could we, just live better? How could really do good with a model like that? That's why actually many people say, the Eastern philosophies, those were really deep, profound philosophical systems that we as Westerners cannot understand because you're so devoured by consumerism and, aggressiveness and this thing. That is called civilization, right? And Eastern philosophies largely are something like, at least some of the most widespread are like, you should basically not live. Take Buddhism, for example. Buddhism is literally the denial of humanity. Basically, it says, life as we experience it sucks. So all you should do is to forget that reality exists, and at one point you will, become something else, which we don't know. That's literally it. Can a civilization stem from this? Christian message is one of probably the single most powerful philosophical system ever invented, because it doesn't actually state, not even once, whether the state should exist or not, whether violence should be used or not. Jesus actually gets violent at some point. Think about the temple when he throws out all those the market that had been put in the temple. There are certain aspects of that is truly human. I think the greatest aspect of Christian religion is humanity. And if you start denying violence, you start denying humanity as well. That's why Christianity is never been a pacifist religion, but just a pacific one. Which means that you will be obliged to use it at some point for actually doing something good, even if you shouldn't do, because the mean in itself is extreme, but you have to get somewhere, which is a different thing. Christian message is so totalizing that it basically tells you, you should be concerned exclusively about your soul. Damn, it's true. If you don't look within yourself, where you can find the answers, how can you decide, how can you take your own responsibility? And it's so truly so, in fact, that you should be able to detach what happens outside of you, that you're essentially not in control of, from yourself, your inner self, from your soul, right? Because essentially what is outside here does not belong to you. Does not belong to you. The world doesn't belong to us. We didn't make it. We're not here because we made the world. We don't understand literally any single thing about what the hell this whole thing is. We will never do. And that's where Christianity gets genial, right? Because it really makes you understand it. So when Jesus says, basically, give back to Caesar what is of Caesar, which is improperly translated sometimes as give to Caesar what pertains to Caesar and then give it to God what is to God. The thing is a bit different than that, because it even says, there is an aspect of this world that will essentially seduce you with the promise of something that will distract you from your inner self. So and the point is so radical, so definitive and totalizing that this sharp separation is required, right? But this has nothing to do with what you will have to do eventually with this world. Because Christianity inherits, for example, the same Judaic tradition that says that you should essentially coexist with Caesar. That's the idea. Christianity gives centrality to the idea of kingship, same Christ. But at this point, the Christological model is meant to be replicated in some ways in the world. Why does St. Paul essentially romanize and even militarizes his own vocabulary? Because he knew that for this religion to spread, there had to be the realization that what the world can be is already present within humanity. True humanity, even the one that during the Roman Empire invaded entire regions of Europe and slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people, because this is what really happened. Because guess what? Those systems worked in that fashion. At times of St. Paul, life was that cheap, for real. St. Paul wasn't a guy, sit somewhere else, in a different space and time. That person lived throughout, the Jewish war, or at least he died more or less in those years in which the first Jewish war revolt began. But that was the mindset. Those were the times, right? And so these words should always be read in their historical context, and these parallelisms are dramatically important if you really even wish to understand what happened later on, when this model had been spread. But there was also a lot of practical life that had to be reconciliated with the Christian message. What do you think? At one point the world became Christian and everything changed. It basically didn't change anything. It didn't change anything. Please don't let me hear those things on this channel, because I will block you immediately, like that, I don't know, the Christianity reduced the combativity of Roman soldiers, and this was a reason for the fall of the empire. Right, these are, seriously messed up, but a lot of people still believe these things, because they have not even stopped thinking what effectively Christianity even achieved at that point. And that passed through civilization, because you can't find the solution. So we will be seeing now, if you don't pass through a sound understanding of the same practices that in fact you're trying to reduce. Christianity was largely spread without violence. It's just another thing that you should start thinking about in terms of, first of all, of actual historical ground, because once again, lots of people, for example, are convinced that Christianity was enforced through violence, that basically Christianity of the world passed through slaughtering people. No, it didn't happen like that. But secondly, look at what Christians read at the time. Look at what Christians thought, where they went, the peoples they interacted with them, how the evangelization was achieved. Look even how the pagan north of Europe, that is by some pictured this extremely resilient and region that opposed itself to Christianity in the first place. Christianization of those countries was largely spontaneous. It even predated an actual Christian political establishment, and it stemmed from the bottom of society. But this is another story, but this is important exactly because of what we've seen before, how strongly rooted actually certain military traditions and warrior ethos were in these very countries. And at that point, you must understand what the Christian message really provides you with, if you really listen to it, also in terms of how to bear the sword. Because we still live in the wake of chivalry, in the way we do. We in our social relations. I mean, we dramatically underestimate how much of this medieval achievements in civilization actually are part of our modern culture, which you don't often hear. It's all about the ancient world, the classical age. It's all about the modern age. It's about contemporary. We are massively influenced by what happened in the Middle Ages, easily more than the modern age, for example. But we will have to explain also why, because this is not strictly to do exactly with the fact that a modern age or a medieval age actually existed. It was always the same civilization, changing certain traits, but for the majority actually retaining a lot. And it's not cultural, it's biological. This is what I would like to make you understand, because it's very, very easy to make cultural relativism, to pretend it was a people that got it all, and we have to stick to those traditions. No, it doesn't work like that, historically speaking. Traditions exist in the measure they work effectively in society, within society, and what I think we seem to lack potently today is that connection between this civil and rational connection between politics and violence that we seem to have lost from quite a time, that these guys 1,000 years ago had dramatically clear in mind, because it still exists today, but we mistake as tribalism, because they've never been taught and educated about the fact that what happened in this point in history, but even before, was not tribalism fully, right? It's still within these peoples, of course, still in early Middle Ages, there was a lot of tribalism, but it was not even entirely that. Because even, I don't know, the Germanic populations, other tribal, they did understand that not everything could be violence. There was a civil order as well. There's always been, right? Because we do know that society cannot work otherwise, but it was at different levels that entailed different, forms of development, etc. That the Christian world had, in its Mediterranean dimension, fundamentally, had already gotten by simply the larger advancements of that civilization. So, let's get to the let's skip this part now, because I know it's getting too complicated today. But please try to follow me. What I wanted to stress here is that there is a literal interpretation, a literal or even material interpretation of the Holy Scriptures that definitely comforted, or seen at least to comfort, within the use of arms, the warrior ethos, to which, however, new values were added, right? For example, isn't it the sword, the symbol of force, of justice, and of wrath of the Lord? Doesn't Jesus say that he's come on earth not to bring peace, but the sword? And who does not have one shall sell his cloak in order to have one. And St. Paul doesn't invite to take the sword of the Spirit, that is the Word of God, and the Apocalypse does not present a sword, a double-edged sword, that comes out from the mouth of the faithful and of the truthful, that sits over a white horse at the head of the angelic militias. Right? It's useless at this point to object the fact that this is just an allegorical meaning. Right? These passages, of course, are not referring to material violence as such. They're talking about something much higher. In Christianity, there are always these two dimensions, right? And they're not symmetrical. The heavens are infinitely superior to whatever happens on earth. But the point is that this still serves for the earth in some way, right? This is, I think, one of the subtlest and most intelligent and genial messages of Christianity. Because Christianity actually says, telling the truth, that the earthly weapons are actually not a positive thing, right? It does. And that's why it's a pacific message, but it never quite says, not even once at that point, that what pertains to the earth specifically shouldn't be violent by all means, because the same prophecies in the Bible actually says that those things will happen, and more especially they must happen. And they happen through humanity, even if it's a divine plan, right? But we already know there is going to be wars, and there are going to be people who wage them, and people who die, right? So this is very different from saying, no, now we have to stop everyone who even bears an arm. No, it doesn't work like that. It never worked like that. Christianity says something very different. That is, you shouldn't care about anything else but what happens in your soul and in the heavens, substantially, because that's the only thing that matters. But what happens out here in this earthly journey is a big mystery. You have to sort it out by yourself, and there is no way. Christianity always leaves to you the option, and more than that, it doesn't give you a practical answer, because you're referentially brought always to think about the heavens. So down here, we are the hell on our own, and we have to sort things out the way it seems more fitting, right? Now, I don't want to talk today about how Christianity eventually and practically agreed to accept violence in some forms. First of all, the Bible actually allows that in very specific conditions, but the way it happened historically, or just ideologically, in terms of literary production, etc., this is another thing. We will see it on other occasions. We made videos on penitence in early medieval Europe connected to violence, etc., but you can watch those. This is another story. What I want to focus in here is what these words could mean for peoples such as the pagan ones at this point, but not only, because these peoples existed even still within the same Christians, who were, for example, habituated to magic. Do you think medieval Christians were Christians because they refused magic? They actually believed in both all the time. It's not that you would practice magic, you were considered to be an heretic. This other story that we have thought, no, if you're a Christian, you should believe just... No. The Middle Ages, at all levels of society, actually including the church, whatever, they always looked at the stars, the thing, because they were connected in part to, of course, the fact that that was part of the creation and whatever, but they believed also in other things. There were certain forces within nature that were kind of external to kind of Christian teachings, but that could be employed in some forms, always stating that, okay, well, there's this kind of a second measure of judgments, like the stars, like astrology, but, first of all, it's about God, right? You could be burned as an heretic only if you said, like, this thing of astrology is actually superior to what the Bible says. Well, at that point, you got burned into ashes, right? But actually, in every single moment, Christian society always believed to astrology. There are people even today believe in astrology, right? So, no, Christianity has never been a totalitarian regime, but it's been a totalizing religion, totalizing philosophy, and that's here that I think also more subtly certain words were so effectively received by these peoples during the evangelization. The evangelization of Central European people in Northern Europeans was difficult, no doubt about this. I mean, Christianization in general, of all peoples, has been difficult. It's been gradual. It had setbacks, and so on. But the way it succeeded, right, was the sensitivity, let's say, that it had towards those same problems of politics and war and society, right? It's not that Jesus talked about, I don't know, football matches and how you can win those. He talked about big issues, right, that have a totalizing ideal, right? And the fact that the message is totalizing was deeply believed, not just by these peoples here. So, for example, in the runes, like an absolute power of some sort that was concretely there, right? Which is something that some Christians actually believed too, in the same scriptures, for example. I mean, let's think about relics. We'll see it afterwards. Think about certain... the church officially actually never said that this is how it works. You know, it's always symbolical. There are... you don't get saved if you overload yourself with relics, right? That's not enough. You can't do that, because you need the redemption, and whatever you do, you can't achieve salvation through that alone. The point, though, is that if I say something like that, I've come as a son of God to bring the sword and not peace. Well, at that point, this is not a statement that you can equivocate, like saying this is a metaphor. Because are you sure this is an actual metaphor? I mean, of course, I mean, the sword here is metaphorically meant, but I mean, the message of violence, do you think at that point is actually metaphorical or allegorical? It's really not. That's exactly what the Gospels mean. And telling the truth is exactly what has happened in the world ever since. Not that it didn't exist before, of course, but minds have changed in that regard. But what we must think is that the same Christians, whether they were, I don't know, coming from Northern Europe or Southern Europe, that doesn't matter by how much time they were Christianized, they did believe fully in these words. And I think this is also what we have lost a bit in biblical exegesis, is that, of course, at the highest levels these things are perfectly recognized, but politically speaking, Christianity seems to have become something else, right? It's just be nice, yeah, that's what's become. Christianity is absolutely nothing like that. Christianity should be a trauma for everybody involved, because if you don't take it as that, you basically don't take it as it should be, and nobody can fully do, by the way, because it's also what the same Gospels say. But, I mean, the whole Bible in general. So, what we are trying to stress here, actually, is that there were certain meanings that the barbarians individuated in the scripture that favored their social and political transformation into more stable, more pacific, and more effective systems. Because this is what Christianization went in parallel with. Right? We must be able to distinguish the political and military history from the in the way it was actually, in which actually happened, and the message that these religions specifically owns, right? Because this is written in the scriptures. What happens in this world? There is no justice in this world. Justice does not belong to this world. So frankly, that Charlemagne invaded, conquered, and subjugated Saxony in a bath of blood in the name of the cross has nothing to do with Christianity proper. And on the contrary, what has to do with Christianity proper, in my opinion, is that 1 century later, those same Saxons were bearing the imperial crown in the name of God and giving stability to a Europe that had lost it from in the last century. That has to do with Christianity. And that has to do with that, of course, with other models that were imported, that were functional to a development. And that's where you can't say objectively that what happened in that regard was like, how, because I see history fundamentally in these terms. Okay, a lot of messed up things happened. And they happen all the time, by a certain degree. I mean, some are worse than others. You can't commend the Holocaust because, it happened, it had to happen. No, it didn't have to happen, and we could have even stopped it. What I'm saying, though, is that what passes through these events is the realization that there is a better way to do things. Right? I think we have improved dramatically as a civilization from World War II. Did really World War II have to happen? Nobody can answer this question. We would have, eagerly prevented it, knowing what effectively happened in it. And, I mean, before, whatever you want to start World War II, I don't know, 1936, 1939, because, China, Ethiopia, but that's where the war had already started, telling the truth. That this is another story. The point I'm making here is Christianization favored, or when in parallel, however, and supported and backed it, the construction of some of the very same models from which our civilization has emerged. And what was the alternative to that? I mean, we're not talking about this deterministically speaking. I'm really talking about what this could have been as a practical solution. Of course, we know history could have gone in radical different ways, but in terms of actual stability, do you think this thing could have followed every other single pattern? Do you think that all those free peoples of Central and Northern Europe could have simply remained the way they were, allegedly happy and free, and all gladly, working at their special society that was so free and egalitarian, smiley? That those were pretty massive black holes. Like they were bad as much as those who waged war on them, if not worse, telling the truth. What political and military history shows us most of the times is that it's not that if I wage war on you and I'm successful, it's necessarily because I'm more evil than you are. If anything, it tells you that you are less capable than I am. Then how eventually I decide to use my capabilities, that's another thing. Right, but even looking at, 9th century Europe, you can't say that what Charlemagne did on the Saxons was something that, at a lesser scale, other peoples weren't doing, even in those places that the Carolingians conquered. These people were butchering and slaughtering and raping and enslaving and selling people on a regular basis, like all the other peoples in the world were doing. Right, this has nothing to do with moral or cultural relativism. I mean, objectively, there were differences of some sort, but what I'm saying here is that not necessarily these were from the side of, the guy who loses is always a poor victim or a poor candid lamb that got butchered, right? No. And if you really want to get to the end of the story under this regard, usually the most enlightened and fair and just societies are the most developed ones. That are incidentally also the ones that can wage more destructions than others. If there is a lesson that we can all learn from history, is that the increase in civilization doesn't absolutely correspond to a lowering of destructive capabilities. It's completely its opposite. And that's what Christianity in itself also makes you aware of. That is to say, this is all happening because God wanted it. But what will you respond to God when you will be in front of this? You know, the realization that there is a responsibility in this contract is very important. Because for pagans, you know, the contract was simply like material. Like, I give you this and you give me that. And it's like you could do it with everything. There is really no commitment of sort. Like, the god didn't receive an half sacrifice and then you are done for. All the worst would happen to you. Christianity tells you something very different that is much more realistic in the life of a person. That is to say, look, you can't even try to you know, to make things work in reality in a certain way by, you know, negotiating with the world, but that will never give you the chance of saving yourself. This was highly appreciated as a message from these peoples here. This is often misunderstood because we take the resistance of certain peoples to Christianization. Chiefly, the main example is Saxony, right? Because Saxony was a bloodbath, let's be honest about it. But that's why before I was telling you, look at how other peoples were Christianized effectively. And you'll see that, yeah, there were certain, you know, the elites did manage to do things on their own populations, importing certain political, social, and religious models that were all cooperating with one another to progressively stratify society, but yet the system grew. So what is more responsible there? Like, where's the model that actually makes the difference? Like, I'm pretty, you know, I still wonder certain things, especially if you think at the lower Middle Ages when these transformations took place, kind of maybe in the most negative fashion, but at the same time, those times were heading also towards something better. So I don't really see the controversy in this. But what I want to stress instead that really the real cultural resistance here happened mostly at the intellectual level. I mean, objectively, these peoples were not educated, weren't literate. I mean, they had their own ideas and views, but they were somewhat less structured, really, than what certain types of educations present everywhere really existed. I mean, it's true that the beliefs of these peoples are very stereotyped, are very categorized, and we often think of them in modernistic and even, in fact, in theistic perspectives. That is also what make those who criticize in turn Christianity to miss entirely the point in this picture, because they assumed that was a sort of, let's say, atheistic world opposed to the theistic one, which is absolutely not true, first of all, but also that there was a sort of symmetrical model presented by Christianity, let's say, and paganism. It was absolutely not. I mean, Christianity really brought an enormous amount of development, intellectual sophistication among these populations. I'm not kidding. Right? We don't have to overestimate what the theoretical intelligence of the people was at the time. Right, it was very low also 100 years ago. We know it. We know it. We can't be denying this. But intelligence still lays somewhere else. And this is also our illusion. I mean, thinking that if a person can't reason in theoretical terms is stupid. Absolutely not. This is not true. But at that point, you should measure that intelligence with, in fact, what the world was really at the time. And it's obvious that this central northern populations were societies were simpler than the others. There's no other way to put it. They were dramatically simpler. They were less developed. They didn't need certain ideas to work in that specific environment. Then the world changes because the world is growing to be economically intertwined. People want to live better. These people need to interact with Christians. They need to trade with Christians. They need to know their word because they realize there is an immense amount of stuff there that they can enjoy as well. And at this point, that's where you get the transformation of their society, not because they were imposed by someone, Christianity. Christianity was largely accepted consensually, and exactly those peoples that are thought to be the furthermost from Christian mindset actually had an extremely rapid Christianization. Like if you take Iceland, for example. I mean, they got converted in like in 2 generations. It was completely pacific conversion, spontaneous. More primitive peoples have less cultural resistance, which gives them a tremendous edge in terms of structuration of their power. This is something you find at several levels. Look at what Normans did in England and in Sicily. Look at what those monarchies were and how they worked compared to the French one, from which they stemmed. And don't tell me that you didn't see in here the relative simplicity and more, and less complicated picture that certain mindsets and that had surely absorbed the local models, but they had done it from scratch. Hence, they decided to give them more functional basis could achieve. So what we are really interested in here is in realizing how these peoples individuated in the scripture certain meanings that were compatible with the reorganization of their society. And this did involve weaponry as well, that at the time was still prominent for every, by any standard, as a military tool to regulate society, because there weren't many other ways to do that, and frankly there aren't even today, right? We do rule the world with military deterrence. What do we have nuclear weapons for? People believe that nuclear weapons are essentially the way for destruction. Nuclear weapons largely, in the right measure, are exactly what prevents us from killing each other, as we have done in 2 world wars, right? So we fail to recognize the civilization that lays even in a sword, and in this sense, the civilization that lays even in the literal meaning that a sword has in a text like the Bible, that is normally and kind of hysterically so claimed, look, and here the Bible talks about war and bloodshed in the name of God, and so what's the point exactly? Do you know anything about this religion? I mean, do you think that's so simple as it works? I mean, they mention a sword and things done in the name of God, and that's enough to be like evil. Have you read the actual text? Do you know what that actually means in this philosophical construction? Rhetorical question. So what happens is that, for example, surely with Christianity, swords were not consecrated anymore with the runes of Tyr, right? Tyr, it's kind of complicated to actually picture him, but it can't be, the Hercules or the Ares of the so-called Germanic pantheon, more or less. So this it's actually seemingly, I mean, there is a huge debate about this, but it's essentially an emanation of the same Odin, right? And it's more kind of fighting hypothesis, right? And somewhat the hero also conceived as the guy who drinks and fights, and he's more kind of the symbol of the warrior humanly manned, whereas Odin himself is more always considering that there is a very few anthropomorphic in this all. These are concepts, like in the minds of those people we can't understand them fully, of course, but Odin, what is Odin? Like, it can take forms, but it's something else. it's a dimension, it's an entity, a force, something that is supernaturally so in a way you can't anthropomorphize. In fact, even the anthropomorphization of certain figures is increasingly influenced operation, right? But so of course the ancient Germanic swords had these engravings with the runes of Thor, but it's very likely that even in Christian times, in those dark, burning forges, the Germanic smiths still striking the iron, the old carmina, as they were called by the in Latin literature, of the blind lord of the dead. And in fact, it can never be that in the intentions of the Christianizers, right, the consecration of arms actually corresponded to two complementary ends. One, it was the acculturating one, right? The connectation, if we can say so, of the and baptizing the ancient sacrality, right? So not eliminating it. It's very important. Christianity would have failed if they had pretended to eradicate these customs and these beliefs. And Christianity largely didn't care. Let's be honest about this. As long as this didn't present an actual theological competitor, which paganism never did, because they objectively couldn't, especially this type of paganism, like they didn't have any chance, they didn't stand any chance in that regard, right? Then there was another side, another aim, which was the exorcistic one, that is, which was much more progressive in showing, essentially, in the name of Christ, those diabolical powers that were present in the arm, in the weapon. So, in other ways, eliminating the residual influx of the old gods, right? This was more difficult, right? And it took time as well. Like, it couldn't be immediate. In some cases it was, and this backfired because Christian missionaries were butchered at some point for this thing, and that's where in the hardest conditions it took the sword, right? And not just, however, from the Christian side of the story, but from within the same pagan reality, because normally these societies were divided between actually adopting the kind of Christian model together with, full sedentarization, building centers of power, entrusting more power to certain leaders, etc. And another one that didn't want that, right? That eventually lost. It did lose because that previous model was more functional to what was happening in the world. Europe is growing here slowly, but it's growing. So in many ways, Christianization passes through the same rhythm, and that's why it took so much. And it probably favored the transformation because it happened at levels of development that were fairly similar at the time. Right, the Franks converting the Saxons, they're basically the same people. But aside from this, even the time probably played in favor of the progressive success of Christianization, because it was not such a brusque passage, right? Like it happened in other situations, right? It was progressive, but especially autonomous in many cases. It played on those chords of in fact internally to these societies. So the old magical rite was replaced by the liturgical consecration, which means that in the place of the runes of Thor were introduced inscriptions, also religious ones, on the blade of the sword. Schwerpunkt is probably right when he observes for the oath the essential part of the sword after Christianization is become not exactly the blade, but the grip, right? This is very important. Like, and in fact, during the Middle Ages, the grip properly tended to become a reliquary, right? While its own its same acquisition of this cross shape could make disappear in the moment in which the weapon was ritually used its functional character of instrument of war, in order to make it, to exalt from it its character of sacred object. So in other words, the sword was passing from this, there is all an enormous literature, and that's why we should have talked about the pagan tradition of the sword as such, about the blade. I mean, obviously as a weapon, the single most important aspect of the sword is still the blade, would always remain the blade. But symbolically speaking, ritually speaking, the attention from the blade with Christianization is shifted towards the grip, right? And the fact that you could essentially, put the sword upside down and having a cross in front of you with the hilt and the guard, right? So, even more than this, Jacob Grimm, probably right, for example, when he observes that the Christian Middle Ages has attempted to substitute the relics of the saints to the arms-like object over which the oath was made, right? And because this catches perfectly the very ambiguous meaning of the insertion of the relics in the hilt of the sword. I mean, this literally happened, as we will see now. This thing that the sword becomes literally something sacred because it also has this supernatural force is a concept that was shared in the by the pagan world and Christian one, but in different ways, right? And the Christian one kind of added to the sword this character of sacralization, even passing through making it contain sacred objects, rather than just writing, Christian things on the blade, which was kind of, all of this is very ambiguous, like, because at this point, and that's what we were talking about before, we have to understand what even was there of wrong, we can say, in strictly Christian terms, in, blessing a weapon that has to perform certain things that are sinful. Like, killing is a sin. Like, the Christians never abandoned this conception. Like, the word differences between certain, the West and East of Europe, for example, relative to this idea, the killing was perhaps not an enormous deal, for example, in the West as much as it was in the Byzantine tradition, for example, but it still was there, and it was pretty alive, even in the moments of development of ever more sophisticated military systems that were ever more deadly, right? So it's important in this regard to understand that this form of Christianism wasn't entirely, it wasn't hypocrite about it, about the fact that the swords really did serve to kill, but it was done with the hope that who was using them would be a just deliverer of violence, let's say, which is a contradiction, but only apparently, because the Christian message does accept, after all, that someone takes care of the situation in a way or another, because it's God who sends them. So, from a very simple perspective, of course, it was important to associate a reliquary to a weapon in order to carry out the oath on the relic rather than on the weapon itself. This is pretty obvious. In the pagan tradition, the blade actually had it was an alter ego of the warrior, and we'll see it later because it continued in the Christian tradition, but at least this thing had to be formalized through a minimal Christian acceptable side, right? And therefore, um, this was a success because it, from one side, the susceptible conservatism of the Germanic warrior was not shaken, essentially, but um, therefore his attitude, the attitude of the warrior, was, mm, you know, not badly disposed towards the new religion as such, right? So it's passing exactly through the sword, which was the symbol of manhood, of virility, of freedom, of power, that, I mean, that Christian meaning to the weapon in itself was a way to further captivate the elites that use these weapons, by the way, because, you know, there is also here, the sword is not just a mere symbol. Like, the sword really costs a lot, right? It's of course widespread at several levels, but there is also a hierarchy of the of actually the quality of the swords. Like, there is an enormous literature. Once again, we can't actually discuss it, but, you know, not swords were alike, right? Swords were done at the time in a way for which just the best were preserved in some ways. Most of others were actually not well done. Like, the best ones were made in a way that not even today we are able to replicate anymore. Even with all our, you know, our engineering capabilities and extremely superior steel quality, etc. But the way these swords were balanced, etc., was amazing. And of course, even the quality of the blade in itself, materially speaking, was all around which these swords gravitated in terms of quality. But these swords are becoming the symbol also something else. So someone was in charge, right? So it's not the single Germanic warrior here that had a single sword blessed. No, these we were talking about chieftains. We're talking about those people in which the same ecclesiastical structures were in contact with, together with the political ones, the secular ones, let's say better, for, you know, making Christianity, the conversion, accepted, right? We have seen it on many occasions. Once again, this was a largely consensual phenomenon. It needed an acceptance from the elites that had to be Christianized. But from the other side, and this is often overlooked because it shows you once again how same Christians, as we have seen the Longobards or the Bavarians before, there were peoples of relatively early Christianization at this point, were essentially believing, still in part, those very magical side of the story that had never disappeared. Right? This thing of the reliquary in the hilt of the sword could be surely an experiment, but even if it wasn't maybe strictly a magical one, at least wasn't it provided with magical components and characteristics? The relics enclosed in the grip didn't multiply the strength of the weapon and granted the invulnerability of those who bear them, such as those fantastic swords of the Germanic epic that sang or that demanded for blood, right? This was the idea. I put the relic in the sword, therefore the sword is better. It's an apotropaic function, right? That's also what the same runes and the tattoos, etc., in those engravings were all about. They were aimed at diverting, essentially, blows. They were really meant to give that strength, but also that security, that safety, that same aggressive, actually, mental predisposition of the warrior needed to comfort, because you don't throw yourself like a fury into the midst of melee if you do not believe by certain standards that in yourself, and therefore through these means, also through these aids and details. I think that warriors at this time lived as warriors in the sense that war was the only thing they did. So they had to care about these details too. It was also not just a matter of, of a superstition. I mean, think that if every chieftain did this, there was a lot of competition, right? And the nobility and even freemen, there were. If you have a better sword than the others, you also feel more confident, and the others kind of the part of the effectiveness of these military cultures passed through even the formality, like looking at what you have in front of you, what he actually means, not just on the battlefield, but also politically and socially, because he can afford certain things, as much as being confident of himself in combat, because maybe he has spent more time than you to train for war, because simply has more money than you have. I mean, more wealth than you have. While you maybe, as a regular freeman, just have to plug the land, right, for surviving. So the whole warrior ethos revolved around these symbolisms as well. And in fact, even the same Christian symbol, right, the symbol of the cross in the sword of the golden age of chivalry, don't you think it had also an apotropaic meaning? These guys could plant the sword on the soil and see a cross in front of which to kneel and to ask for protection, having a cross in their hands. This is very important. In fact, if you look at the ritual of adoration of the cross still today, what does it says? Ecce crucem Domini, fugite partes adverse. Right? So this is pretty meaningful. Here's the cross of the Lord. Flee enemies. Right? That's literally it. Right? The cross symbolizes the fury of God on the field, the wrath of God. The enemies flee in front of the cross, of the symbol of God. So it's obvious that this could be easily associated to the sword as well on the field. So there is this psychomagic concept of war within which the analogy between the cross and the sword match perfectly, right? And it's obvious. I don't think it's even actually demonstrated, but it kind of makes sense. And there are definitely admirable examples of reliquary swords. For example, the one of Roland, that contains a tooth of Saint Peter, Saint Basil's blood, Saint Denis' hair, a bit of the Virgin Mary's clothing, right? And another sword even contains a nail of the cross, right? These are things you find in epics of the chivalric times and feudal times. And if the warrior, swearing on such treasures of relics, betrays the oath, he's not just a perjurer, he's also sacrilegous, right? And these were ways through which, in the evolution of medieval warfare, actually were necessarily required from politics and society, because there weren't many other ways to grant discipline at that point. So if there is such a shared consensus that, Christianity is the true and only religion, that you must have faith, and the political as well as ecclesiastical authorities recognize the right to bear arms as a great duty, by the way, to someone, they should do it by imposing, therefore, from all the rest of society in some ways, because these represent the very elites of society, to enforce you the discipline in that sense, through symbolism, through the idea that if you betray what you have in your hands and over which you have sworn an oath, right? That is with a sacred weapon. It even contains relics of saints, actually, or allegedly, but still, that's what you have sworn on. So that's your responsibility at that point. You must be up to the task. Here is all that enormous cross, in fact, that the knight had to bear. That's literally it, right? The sword is the cross that the knight has to bear, and it's heavy. I mean, the knight has to sacrifice his own life, just like Christ in the struggle against the enemies of the faith, because, the enemy of the faith is also who betrays Christian morals in that regard. So it's not just about, this is not kind of religious war. This is about the fact that there is an order in society that has to be maintained, right? So, as we were saying before, war was standard at the time in political dialectic. This was not a way to wage war against the evil, like pagan, let's say, just because it was a pagan. This was about really embracing a model that could order society, even if when this had already been Christianized. But it's obvious that for those peoples that were just evangelized, the proof of their commitment did pass chiefly through these symbols that for them were enormously important, because their societies, their cultures had revolved all around this very thing. And it's obvious that the relics as a Christian innovations are very, evident. They're very easy to interpret in this regard. But there are other hints, let's say, other aspects that can be found in the swords of the chivalric epos that reveal a very close relation with those of the Germanic myths, right? For example, banal thing, they have a name, the Durendal of Roland, the Joyeuse of Charlemagne, the Excalibur of Arthur. So all eminently Christian figures, so especially in the chivalric epos, that have swords that have a name, just as they normal in the pagan reality, right? And probably we shouldn't be so eager to attach a strictly either Christian pagan dichotomy to this all, because even the Christian world, as we've seen, kept believing in things that were normal from a world that had always praised the warlike character of those who were in charge, right? It was not an invented. This didn't change with Christianity, so we don't have to be surprised in the first place that a world was used to that for millennia would essentially maintain this. It's such a fairly simple thing that was actually very important, because these people probably really, not obviously, maybe Charlemagne here is being the real historical figure, but whichever also Roland and Arthur were, personally, they surely probably truly believed in this. The fact that the sword was an alter ego of the purse. We've talked a lot about the Franks. We've seen how the Carolingians were all about not even the gospel, not even Christianity proper. They were all about Judaism. Charlemagne was obsessed with the Old Testament. He was obsessed with the of David and the enemy. There was all this heavy. In fact, why, according to you? Because of course the Old Testament is much more violent and military-like than the Old Testament. Although the New Testament. Although the New Testament is also loaded with the symbolism in a kind of higher form, right? The Franks at this point were Christian, formally speaking, but in practice they were far from that. They saw an easier point of reference to the wars of the Jews in the Old Testament, and in the more philosophically, I can't say more philosophically sophisticated, but more kind of ideal and exoteric, if you want, Christian message, right? That has instead a great military. I think about, I don't know, the hymn to the Logos, and that those meanings are powerful, and they do echo a military context, a military clash, right? So, and there is all this arcane origin of the same swords. Think about Excalibur, that is extracted from the rock, right? And this is typical, we know it, the Sarmatians used to do this in the sacred mounds, where the burials of the warriors, that over which these swords were fixed, and that embodied, in fact, the same warrior, right? It was covered, I think, in the Alan tradition of the Sarmatians, this men covered in iron, like cataphracts, were the ancestors of the medieval knight, conceptually speaking. The Arthurian legions emerged all from that. It's been hypothesized from these Sarmatian auxiliaries that the Romans stationed in Britain, that remained there, keeping these equestrian and armored traditions that saw in the sword. And this is typical of the steppes. Even in the metallurgy of the steppes has always been very advanced, and that there is also this symbol. We will have to talk about this in detail at one point. For example, also in the Lancelot in prose, the sword disappears magically at the death of the king, and is caught by this famous hand emerging from the waters. But even the Durandal of Roland, right? So we're talking about Carolingian times, as a bit later, and definitely in a fully kind of more sound Christian context. It's the angel of God that consigns to Charlemagne the sword of the fallen Roland, right? With the aim, right, to let the sword being you bear by the best paladin. So God actually wants this sword to be used, right? Not to die with Roland, but actually to serve the church and by means of the Christian emperor, right? So and these swords have their own personality. For example, the Durandal in the fatal day of Roncevaux, the Battle of Roncevaux Pass, or also Roncesvalles if you prefer, the sword doesn't want, right, as a person, it doesn't want to break, for example, doesn't want to abandon her own lord. The sword is a living being here. It decides what she wants, right? And this is, in fact, there's a beautiful parallelism, you could say, with the sword and the loved woman. The sword in the Chanson de Geste, in this, for example, think about the Roland proper, is to symbolize the woman, to replace literally the woman, since in Roland actually there is a lack of female characters, and say of amorous hints like in the thing, aside from the kind of quick and kind of pathetic appearance of Alde, that loves Roland, but he doesn't give a damn because he loves his sword, right? This is pretty messed up, right? And this actually tells a lot also about the anthropology of warriorhood, that deriving from the ancient comitatus was a society of segregated warriors, and so women didn't ideally participate this way. I mean, it was another thing, right? So actually these men were conceptually on their own, and they let's say, their life was entrusted to something that didn't have to do with their disposal of it. Their life belonged to the warband, for example. So the sword began at that point. The only but this is something, even if you look at training of modern soldiers, I mean, they tell them to love their guns because they deliver death. This is something we have maintained culturally speaking, and it's pretty damn effective because we know, anthropologically speaking, you must train a soldier to love his gun because he has to kill people with that. That's what soldiers do. So what do you think our defense works for? We need to be defended by people who know their deal, who don't have to hesitate when they have to take down an enemy to safeguard their country. Well, this is exactly what it is that this military lifestyle that is typical of military professionals, like the warriors of the Comitatus war bands, or either or Charlemagne's paladins for that matter, really make their life exclusively about this craft, including female company. Like their sword becomes their woman, and it's kind of if you look at Roland's Song of Love, for example, he's so high and hearty. And the one that he makes for his sword at the moment in which he's going to leave her a widow because he's about to die, and kind of complaining because of eventually of the destiny of this sword, because once she will be without her lord, that it's going to be important for her to belong actually to someone who deserves her. This was a real problem among actual knights and lords. I mean, if I die, what would my wife will do about this? Because of course, at this point, these knights had their wives and whatever, but it was a world that was still largely evolving now about this mostly warrior thing. The Carolingian knight, conceptually, was a person who lived for war. Like, they stayed half of the year, essentially, in a campaign with other knights, burning and pillaging and massacring, and that's essentially what their life was about. And you can't live a life like that if you objectively don't make, you don't create a moral out of this, if you don't see what you're doing, something sacred, something just, right? And what happens with Roland at the end of the day is that he convinces, let's say, the sword that he's dying, and that he hides them eventually under himself to protect her beyond his own life. Let's read actually a part of the Chanson de Roland, because it's very meaningful. So these are scattered passages from the final phase of the battle of the Roncevaux Pass, when Roland realizes he's gonna die. And okay, we'll comment this later. And it says, "O Durendal, noble one, you are to be pitied. Since I am finished, I no longer have you in my care. May no turn-tail ever possess you. A very good knight has owned you for a long time. Never again shall there be such a sword in blessed France. O Durendal, how beautiful you are, how clear, how bright, how you shine and flash against the sun. I feel sad and heavy-hearted for this sword. I would rather die than have it remain with the pagans. O Durendal, how beautiful you are, and how very holy. It is not right for the pagans to own you. You must be served by Christians. May no coward ever possess you." So this is beautiful, and so you realize what emerges here is the guy is desperate because he's dying, but the problem is not that he's gonna pass away. The problem is that he will leave his sword alone. The whole thing revolves here about his sword. Like, what is the last thinking of a of a Carolingian knight, his wife, his children, his castle, no, his sword, and let's say, obviously this is the chanson de geste. It's all very idealized, right, naturally, so it's obvious that, I mean, a Carolingian knight would have even more than one sword, but let's not overdo, because actually swords really, as we've seen before, had this kind of different quality. Of course, a Carolingian knight would have more than one sword, especially a paladin, like an important military man, military official, whatever. They would have more swords, but one was special, one was better than the others. And as we have seen, these handcrafted blades could be really like masterpieces, and they were fairly rare. Not everything came out of the of a smith production was actually a good sword, right? And that's why there was a market of this, and the elites could afford the best weapons in this. They were unique pieces in terms of actual manufacturing. And they costed a lot, right? So this fact that the sword would be your companion as much as the horse, for example, or even more in this case at least, is very important, because it costed too. Like, it was a cost that represented in many ways also, for example, these swords were passed down through the generations. I mean, of course, technology somewhat evolved over time, but think about, even in the pagan tradition, actually not all swords were buried, as we know. I mean, this is kind of obvious, but what I mean is not all the best swords actually were buried with their owners. I mean, if Roland had died in I don't know, pacifically, probably his sword would have gone to his son, right? So, of course, the dead would be buried with splendid weapons. But at the same time, there was also something about, like, probably some of the finest swords were actually preserved, right? In fact, if you bury a person with a sword, you lose a lot of money. Also, graves were unknowingly profaned for this reason, because there were grave like tomb thieves, I don't know how to define them, that would kind of open the sepulchres just to steal the swords. It happened very often, frankly, because they were also made of material, precious materials and all. They were really very expensive. So the other aspect that you're reading here in the Chanson de Roland is this idea that the sword is holy, right? It also is clear, bright. I mean, this older ideas of the fact that swords had to be also polished and you could mirror yourself in them, and this was a great quality. You shine and flash against the sun. I mean, this beautiful, pure word. Like, it's also a matter of actual impurity, purity and purity when you make it, and you have to. One day we will talk about how swords were practically made at this point, but also the fact that that the person that would own it, right? Here Roland is sure about it. Someone else will take this sword, and it could be a Saracen, even if, at least in the Chanson de Geste, if we know that at the Battle of the Roncevaux Pass, it was actually the Basques. They were Christians, although barely, in some ways, not much more than the Carolingians after all, that actually attacked the Carolingian rearguard with Roland and so on. But that someone that, whoever he was, could not be worthy of her, because she had belonged to a good knight, a knight that was worthy of her. Like, and this is, she's treated, and here also, I mean, may no coward ever possess you. A very good knight has owned you for a long time. May no turn tail ever possess you. I mean, this idea is very close actually to one of the women. While the warrior is dying, he would have thought, of course, also of his wife, and he would have been, who will marry her? Like, there is a passage from Jean de Joinville chronicle, which during the Fifth Crusade in Egypt under Louis IX, one of a French knight is killed against the Saracens, and two other knights, Joinville writes, were actually talking in front of the corpse of this knight, wondering, laughing, who would now take his wife, because apparently she was very beautiful. And Joinville notices very bitterly, but very very satisfyingly, that actually those two guys died themselves during the crusade, and that both of their wives actually married again. So even the fact, of course, you die in battle, you think, who will ever have my woman? Like, let not it be a coward, because I was a great knight, right? Let's hope that she doesn't get married with one of this other scum. There was an enormous competition and hatred among each other, and even the same marriage, and getting married with the right woman was an enormous thing politically, in terms of status, prestige, and money as well, right? So here, literally in this chanson de geste, the sword embodies the woman in many ways, but at the same time is actually evocative of the fact that there was a totalization of the symbolism of the sword that went beyond, in many ways, because the mere accessory symbolism. Literally, the sword was the symbol, in the sense, rather of the man, right? Of the virility of the man, of the name of the man, right? Which was naturally connected to the wife as well, and so this is all what it revolves around, the sword. So Roland died, and while he is passing away, he doesn't think about Alde, the beautiful, because Alde was beautiful here, and she will die of heartbreak when she will know that Roland died, right? Alde was totally in love with him, and therefore while he dies, Roland does not think about the splendor of Alde's blonde hair, that sublimes her beauty, and in front of his eyes that are about to close, but the Durandal, right? The flaming Durandal, this companion of lots of battles, etc., that owned all the relics. By the way, the relics we were saying St. Peter's tooth, St. Basil's blood, St. Denis' hair, etc. The clothes, saying the Virgin Mary's clothing, etc. We're all in the Durandal, right? And this is very interesting, and it also makes you understanding why this word was so holy. So you realize all the intertwining of kind of pagan and Christian models at the same time, of earthly and heavenly models at the same time. So it was a huge responsibility to bear a sword like that. Your name was tied to that sword, right? It was an immense thing, especially in a moment in which, for example, there was no heraldry yet. I mean, there were certain symbols, but the sword could as well really characterize who you were. I mean, it's likely that, I don't know, Carolingian knights would look at each other, chiefly thinking about which sword the guy had, right, in terms of status, of prestige, and that's how you recognized them. Bear in mind that the sword was the symbol of manhood, but also military character. I mean, in the sense, the only way to distinguish, in the absence of uniforms, the way to distinguish a person, a military man, let's say, from a civilian, was literally the sword, the cingulum militaris, right, in Latin. The right to bear swords. Not everybody could. Like, there was an idea of nobility. Today we didn't stress about this, but like, especially at this point, and with Christianization, there was also the idea of, like, as we were saying before, that you're not dealing actually with freemen, right? You're dealing with the elites, right? It's not the freemen anymore that count. Christianization expanded through the Carolingian conquest, right? And that's the moment in which political and social structures stratify. and therefore who counts is not just one of the many warriors who can bear a spear, a shield, maybe a sword, but they're kind of light infantry, medium infantry. At this point you start having heavy cavalry. In the sword, actually the Sparta, even the same Germanic tradition had derived this exaltation about the sword in a moment in which they had actually adopted the Sparta. There was a Celtic, a Latin-derived sword, just like from the Roman side, because before the major symbol was the spear, right? The major weapon, the major symbol of virility, of manhood, it was the spear. Now, eventually it would be the sword, and that's why you understand that also during the migration era, compared to the ancient world proper, already something had changed. Because there's a big difference between a guy who bears a spear, and a guy who bears a sword. Well, at the time of Charlemagne, you start having someone who also has a horse on a regular base, and a sword and a spear, and that trains regularly with a lot of resources. So if you want to Christianize these societies, you have to Christianize the key here, which is the elite who can afford that equipment, and that whose equipment must be Christianized, sacralized in Christian terms, right? And therefore that's how Roland dies, with the sword and the elephant under him, with his brains exploded, and because that's how he killed himself, actually, not to fall into the enemy's hands. And the Christian paladin in here actually recalls, but obviously the lords of the Frankish, Alemannic, Longobards cemeteries, right? The great lords of the broken bones that slept solemnly with the sword at their side. Before that, the peak of the archaeologists, of the indiscreet archaeologists, would violate their secret shadow, right? The secret darkness. But there is an enormous continuity, right? And we will see this better when we will actually talk about what was the sword in the pagan mindset at that point, before Christianization, or even during. Because once again, Christianization went on slowly, so there are certain things we can't see, right? They were shared in different ways. There are certain costs. I mean, just archaeologically speaking, the fact that people got Christianized didn't mean magically that they were like less militarized, necessarily speaking. I mean, on average it can be true, but you can't make the parallelisms between two different peoples in this regard. If they get completely Christianized, they stop bearing weaponry, and this doesn't mean that they stop knowing how to use them in certain cases, right? On the contrary, and this is typically evident, especially in the Frankish society, which made an increasing use of certain panoplies, but at least at certain levels of society that were different from the one of the average freeman. So the whole picture, I don't know, today I think I spent a lot of time talking about other things than maybe what you expected, right? I made this long introduction in stating that the sword, the Christianization, all the thing, but I think it's important to get the basis straight at this point, because that's how I think at that point I'm mostly worried about this content to be misunderstood, because I frankly don't hear anyone telling these things, and I don't know how people are gonna take them. I'm surely many people hate me because of things I say at some level, because they think that you have to be blindly either pro-pagans or pro-Christians or pro-certain tribalistic or ethnicistic aspects. I don't give a damn about that. I'm here just to draw a picture that I try to make it kind of accurate, and that's why I talk a lot, but it has to be also functional. It has to make sense, and if you don't say certain things before, you can't even orientate the person, because this all really serves to the point of making an ethical difference, in my opinion. It's not so simple as saying, okay, well, we tell the story like in here, oh, look at this sword, it was cool, here warriors used it, look at here. No, we can't make that. History is something you must use to improve yourself, because otherwise, ethically speaking, right, because otherwise what do we study history for? For spending time before we die? Because if that's essentially what YouTube videos are normally conceived like this, look, this cool shiny thing for 5 minutes, because yay, that's cool to watch. Yeah, that's how it sounds most of the times. I'm here just to speak my mind and hoping to make sense, because I also reflect on this while I am talking about it. It's not a passive attitude here that I just delivered the content. I also reason on it. And the fact that I speak so much and I care for you to understand is that these topics are massively complex, right? You can't simply say, okay, we deal with this, and like in 2 hours we exhaust the topic. We must extend, we must expand at the background, otherwise all these talks would be meaningless, right? Once I told you that, okay, the Christians began to insert relics in the swords so that the newly Christianized people could be kind of more okay with that. 10 seconds, even less. Can you make a video like it? What do you think you get from it? How can you be enriched by such a view? I must be thought-provoking, it must be annoying, it must be pedantic, like I must make this videos lasting 2 hours, because otherwise it doesn't change anything. Like a person listens from that concept for 10 seconds, and then what do you do with that? You go on as if it wasn't just a little thing. So instead, if you wonder why someone speaks for 2 hours about something, it's because maybe that something requires a bit more of concentration than the usual. Alright, to be understood. Well, okay, so I quit it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.